I'm here because I've been focused for a couple years on how algorithms affect everyday life. And so that's the bank account, that's the global economy, and also what we read and who we date or where we're going or how we get there. But what I'm interested in is not so much the things themselves, but actually what that might mean. And my background is partly coming out of game design. I had a game development firm for several years that became the New York office of Zynga, and have moved on to the MIT Media Lab. And basically what we're pursuing are games and narratives, which are not really what I'm going to talk about today, except maybe one, this one, which, is there anybody in the room who actually knows this one, who played this one? Because usually the answer is nobody, and that's what we get today. So this is a game from 1984 called Core Wars. This is a game in which it's a two-player game, invented in 1984. This is a game in which each player writes an algorithm and then lets it loose on the other one. What you're watching is a very famous match from 1994. This is Dwarf Scout versus Little Factory. This is Dwarf Scout engaging in a buffer overflow attack. This was really radical at the moment. This is the dramatic part. This is not a popular game. There's nothing to do after you write your algorithm except to just sit there and watch it win or lose, which is totally abstract, right? So we'll see. So this is Holland in the 20s. This was an early prototype. And what Holland is doing in the 20s is they're building machines. This is a real one. It looks like a joke, but it's amazingly real. They're building machines to listen to the air. The airplane's been invented, the First World War is over, but there's this clear sense that something ill might blow in eventually. And so they design these machines to listen to the air, to listen to the sky, hoping to hear airplanes before they arrive. And over time, miniaturization kicks in. You get certain efficiencies. A personal model gets developed. A pre-computing version of Moore's Law kicks in. And then we arrive here, personal informatics, 1927. And this is funny. It's a funny image. Everything about it, the idea that you would comb your hair before you strap this to your head, everything about it is funny, except that this is a consequential business, listening to airplanes before radar was invented. In this, you can see the desperate attempt to do what we've always tried to do, which is to receive information before the information becomes action. They wanted what we all want, which is to know what's going to happen before it happens to us. So radar gets built, and this, in a way, is going to be the through line for the next 15 minutes or so, which is that every time we solve a problem, we make one. Or as Paul Virilio says, the invention of the ship was also the invention of the shipwreck. So here, radar solves for the threat of strategic bombing, but also makes it impossible to engage in it until around 1990. Here's the F-117 stealth fighter bomber. It's used in the 1990 Gulf War to do something that had never been done before, to fly over enemy territory undetected. And this is, of course, foolproof, except that it's not at all, right? I happened to be sitting at Lockheed Martin when this happened, when an F-117 was shot down over Kosovo. And this is a story, like many of the ones that I'm going to tell you today, that ends in a crash. This is a crash that, at the time, nobody could explain, even though all the pieces were right there. They couldn't explain it because there was literally no language that we had in which this was even possible, because a crash could never happen. And the language in which this could never happen sounds something like this, that if you have a plane in the sky, of course, radar will see it. If you throw a radar signal against it, there's 52 tons of metal in the sky. It's not just going to pass through it magically. So if you shape it a certain way and you code it, the idea is you can't make it disappear, but if you can take the big thing and just sort of break it up into a million little things, like say a flock of birds, it means that you'd have to adjust the radar to be able to see every bird in the sky. And if you're a radar, that's a really, really bad job. Right? So how did this happen? And I found out years later, I happened to meet a Hungarian physicist who had been working during the Cold War, who actually built for the Soviets at the time a black box that wasn't looking for planes using radar. They built a black box that was basically looking for electrical signals moving through the sky. And every time they saw an electrical signal moving through the sky that had no radar signature, they thought, well, that probably has something to do with the Americans. And this is what he did. And so we were sort of talking, and it's an interesting guy, about a bunch of interesting stories. And he said, yeah, the fundamental premise here is that to make something visible, you just have to learn how to look. And I said, so that's good. So you negated 60 years of aeronautic research. What's your Act Two? What did you do when you grew up? And he said, financial services. And I said, oh, financial services, because those are in the news a lot lately. And that was sort of, this was the beginning, this is quite some time ago now, that was the beginning of my education and interest in his Act Two, and for many of us, the beginning of a very interesting story, right? Which is basically the black box for Wall Street. Black box trading, algo trading, the physicists of Wall Street. Because basically, big traders have the same problems as the United States Air Force, right? Which is that they can't move a large position through the market. Obviously, it's like opening in poker all in. So they engage in forms of financial camouflage. I don't think I really need to explain too much to the people in this room. It starts with iceberg algorithms. And, of course, the joke in this, and we all know this by now, is that the same math that you use to hide something is also the same math that you use to find it. So you have predatory algorithms, HFTs. They just look differently at the market. And so here we are, and it's 70% of activity in the operating system that was formerly known as pensions and mortgages. What could go wrong with that? Of the many names for it, this was my favorite, the crash of 245, P&G at a penny, and then at 99,000. Giving it that name, I quite like, because it really, the idea that it was really just about this moment. And the stock market loses 9% in 5 minutes. Here's part of what's interesting is that to this day, and it's a couple years ago now, nobody has total consensus on exactly what happened in there. Right? Because all we have left at this point, once 70% of the market looks like that, is just a monitor where a bunch of numbers go up and down and a big red button that says stop. And here we are in 2013, and we're writing the unreadable. And all of this because it must be somehow better than something else. It must be better than the sort of tightly regulated information systems made out of humans evaluating and acting. So among other things, we built the better alternative trading system known as BATS. By the way, not a great name for a trading platform. The exchange optimized for these algorithms. They account, at least they did account for about 11% of all US trades. And that is going so well. I'm sure you know this one. It's going so well that they go to IPO themselves. The trading platform itself goes to IPO, and so they introduce a new ticker, and that's when the wheels come off the wagon. And basically, every single stock listed that started with an A or a B lost about 9% of its value, including a company called Apple, just in a few minutes, and in 1.5 seconds. In 1.5 seconds. BATS, the exchange that is handling these trades, went from $16 to a 50th of a penny. And here's the gag, is that they withdrew their IPO, of course, and the software is still running. So BATS takes the hit, and there's data scientists at NANEX who are like some of the best data scientists in the world. They're at NANEX in Chicago, and they're looking through all the market data, and they say, BATS says, yeah, you know what? It's an error in the trading system. It's a bug. And the guys at NANEX say, actually, it's not a bug. That was a deliberate attack. That was a deliberate attack on BATS by not quite sure yet. So BATS, right, the people who made the trading software, are now in a position where they understand themselves to be better off saying that it's a bug than a feature. But it seems to be that it really was a feature. And sometimes it really is a bug, right? Here's the Knight debacle a few months later. This is another 11% of the market where they accidentally bought and got stuck with $440 million in fucked up tickets, right? They acquired buying at the offer and selling at the bid because they accidentally released the test software on the live server called the global stock market. And it took over half an hour just to even find out what was going on. Right? Circuit breakers didn't kick in. It's quite incredible. And all of this because the market no longer has a human interface. And isn't it kind of fascinating, right, that all the tools that were designed to make all of this increasingly legible have made it impossible to read? It has no human interface left. It's just this illegible complexity. And I think it's weird, right? I mean, this is me. I stand far outside of this, right? I'm in Massachusetts, whatever, right? But isn't it strange that when you add computers to physics, we unleash the Higgs boson, and you apply it to biology, and we get the genome. But we unlock it here, and we're like further away from understanding the market than we've ever been, arguably, right? So data scientists, right, NANEX, the guys in Chicago, they're trying to learn how to read it. And here they're charting the rise of algorithmic trading over the last few years up until the threshold where it no longer supports a human reader. So it's not totally illegible. They use math and they use magic and I don't even know what. And they do what we've always done since the time that we navigated by constellations. Whenever we find data that doesn't seem to have an author, we give it a story and we give it a name. So they named this one the knife, the carnival, the Boston shuffler, castle wall, twilight. This one doesn't have a name yet. It's actually, I guess it's probably over a year old now. This is the CME Globex Crude Complex Futures and Options, a long word for crude oil. This is a transcript of the moment when crude oil left the building for about 75 minutes. This is a stack of quotes that queue and get sent again and again and again and again, 12 times. And NANEX's analysis, standing from outside of it, they said a system problem caused a blast of quotes that corrupted a memory queue, causing the software to believe the queue was full at the time. Or, as noted in a forum that was following this, oh shit, Crude got to DDoS. So somebody unleashed an algorithm, crude joke, intentionally or not, that effectively pulled a denial of service on a particular sector of the market. It's kind of incredible. And I don't know, is it just me, right? But I think about Dwarf Scout and Little Factory back in Core War, and you realize that Core War back in 1984, that it was prescient, right? That if chess, all games sort of do this. They're a model of the world, that if chess is somehow an abstraction of war and Monopoly is some kind of story about capitalism, then Core War is kind of the masterpiece of the 21st century right here, because there's nothing abstract about it. This isn't an allegory, this is an audition. This is a rehearsal for about 25 years later when algorithms just like these would be fighting for real with a couple $1 billion on the line. So you picture Dwarf Scout and Little Factory, and you picture Carnival and the knife and the flash crash and the bats crash and Knight's $440 million beta release error. Right? And physics researchers have estimated that this has happened in the last 5 years. Anybody want to guess how many times? It's 18,000. 18,000 sort of black swan events, which don't sound that very black swan-y to me if it's 18,000 times in 5 years, right? It was in Wired that Chris Anderson said, with enough data, the numbers speak for themselves, but of all the numbers of Wall Street's big data, 18,000 crashes speaks the loudest. And what is happening here? Well, what's happening is that there's basically only 2 ways that these algorithms can get built. There's 2 ways that they can get built, and they're both sort of scary. Basically, the 2 ways they can get built is either they can be written by humans or they can not be written by humans. And both of these are extremely problematic. So when they're written by humans, it means that somewhere inside there's like a human idea in there, right? That there's actually some kind of ideology, right? So the really good example for me is Robert Parker. This is the most flattering picture I could find of him. This is the guy who decides whether your vineyard is going to succeed or fail, right? Like it gives the Parker Index for wine. And so it was Orley Ashenfelter, economist at Princeton, who basically kind of just like went back into Parker's data and said, look, it's wine, it's quantitative, right? There's only a few variables. There's soil, there's grapes, there's weather, There's just like a couple different things that are really going on. And he basically kind of reverse engineered Robert Parker's taste into an algorithm and produced an algorithm that can tell you what the Parker index will be better than Robert Parker. Actually better than Robert Parker, who will drink the same wine that he drank 5 years ago and give it a different rating with about 20% volatility in there, right? Algorithm doesn't do that, right? So the thing is that this is producing a quantitative measure, but on the inside there, it's still Robert Parker, right? And it doesn't announce that. It doesn't have a byline. It just feels like math, right? And all of these algorithms, right, they all have somebody inside. There's never a byline, but there's somebody in there. Like the vision detection algorithms that we use, they're all built on a deep, deep stack that at their very core, like way, way back in the day, were trained on Playboy centerfolds. Here it is training over on the left. The MP3 compression algorithm is trained on Suzanne Vega's voice, right? It was totally rewritten right before release to accommodate specifically the tones in Suzanne Vega's voice, right? So the idea that every algorithm that's out there actually reflects somebody's idea of the world, and yet that's not how we treat them. We treat them as truth. We treat them like math. But the only thing that's scarier than the idea that there's like a person in there somehow is the idea that there's nobody in there. And that's when you get into like genetic algorithms, which I had a hard time getting my head around because I studied sculpture. And so this was really helpful for me. This is a genetic algorithm that's basically being trained to, the fitness test here is, use a bunch of wheels and a bunch of weight, just get from point A to point B, go. And like no real guidance on this, just go. And I can watch this for hours because it's like watching a puppy in the snow because you're like, just put the wheels on the bottom. Like, this is obviously not going to work, right? Like, right? And you just watch it. But it's a genetic algorithm, and so basically it learns, right? It's learning. It doesn't really have an idea, but it's learning just over and over and over again using some rudimentary fitness tests that there are some strategies that are better than others, and you leave that on a laptop for about an hour or so, and you get this. And it's kind of amazing, right? It's kind of scary and kind of delicious. And the thing is not because it's smart, but because it seems smart without any underlying sensibility that we would recognize as common sense. And you can take this really far. It's just a short step downhill to where you just add a gun to that and have a tank. And this is one of the photos that was used in automated detection for the DoD in early neural network training. This is a story which, by the way, not verified. So it's a story that's often told but is not verified. But it's a good story, and if this isn't true, something just like it is true. And it's a story about the Department of Defense, which is setting out to train cameras to basically detect, is there a tank in the field or not? And just like what I showed you with the genetic algorithm a minute ago, we're not even going to say what a tank is, right? We're just like, it's unstructured, just go. And they trained it with 100 photos that had a tank in it and 100 photos that didn't, and it worked out really well. And then they went to test it and throw a bunch of other photos that had tanks in them and didn't, and it was total and utter chaos. And it was performing so well against the photos that they had trained it with, they went back and they had a human look at them and see what was going on. And what was going on is that all the photos with the tanks in them were on a sunny day, and all the photos without the tanks in them were on a cloudy day, right? And that's, turns out, is what they had trained the neural network to do, is to tell the weather. So this is what happens when you just have data and information without a theory. Right? Because answers are different than explanations. And what's valuable in experiments and in data is not in the answer themselves, it's in the explanation. And that's the part that humans actually need to own. That's the part that we sort of surrendered, right? Just ask bats, right? We need explanation, because for better or worse, explanations and stories are still the protocol for the human mind. And in algorithmic machine intelligence, we just have answers, and they either succeed or fail, and when they fail, they crash. And not every crash ever gets explained someday. This is a photo from a particularly tragic crash, Air France Flight 447, lost over the ocean in 2009. This was super tragic. It took 2 years just to find the black box on that. And beyond the tragedy, it was an important crash because it was so unclear what had happened. They understood some of the telemetry, but not the decisions by the pilot. And it's what led a really smart guy, former banker Ashwin Parameswaran, who wrote about this on his blog and said, this is the problem, is that people make poor monitors for computers. And he's talking about air crashes, but really what he's talking about are financial markets. Just to try to distill what is actually a very complex and nuanced argument, he says, these disasters are not driven by human error or systems error alone, but by fatal flaws in the interaction between human intelligence and complex, near fully automated systems. He's talking about Flight 447, but he's also talking about the flash crash. He's also talking about everything that happens every day, right? That this interaction between human intelligence and machine intelligence that crashed 447 and maybe 50 other flights like it also crashed the market in 2010 and maybe 18,000 times since then. And it doesn't even really need to be fully automated, right? This, in a way, is what happened a few months ago when from a macroeconomist perspective, when a few amateurs, PhD candidates at UMass Amherst, took on the Reinhart Rogoff studies on austerity that were used to determine actual economic policy. And they discovered a spreadsheet error that told a very different story that had excluded data from countries like Canada and Australia, proper countries, that just had been overlooked because of the calculations in Excel. And well, there's a couple interesting things about this. First of all, that data was used to determine real like actual policy. 1, 2, detected by amateurs, but 3, unusual because that data was still in human readable form, because it was in Excel, right? Like what's remarkable about this story is that this is one where we could still read what we'd written, even if it was too late to revise it. But most of the time these days, we're not writing for a human reader because it's not humans that read it. This is one of my favorite things. This is a car in Poland that has replaced its license plate with a SQL injection hack so that every traffic camera that sees it will drop this car from the database. And it's beautiful because this is what we're doing, right? We're not writing for each other anymore. We're writing for the machines, right? And this is sort of the oldest story. I've been telling you for like 15 minutes, right? Police use radar to detect speeders. Speeders use black boxes to detect the radar. So police start using cameras to eliminate the need for radar detection. And so drivers design their cars for the cameras, right? And so this is the perfect allegory, right? Like any system built around algorithmic interpretation of data as opposed to human interpretation of the world around them is vulnerable to types of attack that no human would be fooled by, right? And that's basically what happened right here, right? What we were just talking about, right? You know, it's like you don't have to write it for a computer because you know that even if it is written for humans, that computers are going to be reading it because what machines are reading these days are what we're reading, and that's why. As we just learned, the AP hack here caused the market to seize up. It was $136 billion that were lost in 5 minutes. And by the way, it didn't come up earlier. Does anybody know where this tweet actually came from? Yeah, the Syrian Electronic Army. The Syrian Electronic Army, pro-Assad hackers who set out to do more or less what they did, which is cause markets to seize. And you know, with a tweet. Now, here's an interesting thing, by the way. So it causes the markets to seize up. 483 retweets. It got to 1,000 before basically it was shut down. So there's only about 1,000 people who actually believe this, right? And that's what's interesting, right? Is that this is something that any human can look at and go, this is probably bullshit, right? And it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter because that's what happens when you remove human evaluation and judgment from the loop that's in there, right? You know, the system has sort of proceduralized alarm, and it renders the system, I would argue, increasingly fragile, right? Even without complex derivatives, just like a simple, like something as straightforward as the news. Right? And as surely as you see that, you know, somebody who bends the news to kind of twist the market, it's not just the news that bends, right? It's the whole world, and you don't have to be a Syrian. You could just be in financial services. And if you sort of zoom out and you look at this on an urban scale, I think this is stuff that probably I don't have to explain to you guys, but it's this idea that we're starting to optimize cities themselves like microchips. There's reasons for it, which has to do with where the internet actually comes up. So this is in Manhattan. That's 60 Hudson Street. That's right where the cables come up, coming out of Staunton Sands here. Well, that's exactly where the internet comes up, which means that, if you're like trying to run algorithms down actually on Wall Street, you're going to be like 8 microseconds behind because you've actually got to get through the cables, and it's going to take 8 microseconds for that information to travel. And it takes 500,000 microseconds to click a mouse, but if you're 8 microseconds behind here, you're a loser, right? So everybody basically relocates, co-locates their servers up right by the hub over on 60 Hudson Street. And this idea that we're sort of reshaping our cities to optimize around network topology is a little weird, you have to admit. This is like that neighborhood which started to get cleared out. I knew some of the architects who were building it at that time. This is a neighborhood that used to be occupied by people who were doing things like sleeping and drinking coffee and raising children. And this is how it was for a while. Those people can now move back because, of course, and I'm sure you guys know this, it's no longer even like that because that itself was not efficient enough, which is why the New York Stock Exchange is no longer in New York. It's over there in Mahwah, New Jersey. Its location itself determined by a bunch of actuarial algorithms that were used to judge what is the least risk from nuclear meltdown, flooding, plane crashes, and so on and so forth. And so it was that Mahwah, New Jersey, a town of 25,000 people, is now the home of the New York Stock Exchange. Again, without any human stepping in and going, yeah, I live near there, or traders live near. No, it's like really just output. It's just like latitude and longitude got spit out, and so it is that the entire New York Stock Exchange, 3 football fields, 15 people working on it, are relocated out there, all so that everybody can get zero latency, or as close to zero latency as possible. A few banks grinding the market, and of course not everybody makes it to the room. Maybe they start somewhere else. Maybe they're in Chicago, so you can find an 825-mile trench that was dug in a straight line between New York City and Chicago for spread networks to get a 13.3 millisecond return, 37 times faster than a mouse click. And all of that just to run the carnival and the knife, right? All of that with dynamite and rock saws, right? Just so an algorithm can close a deal 3 milliseconds faster on a communications framework that will never carry a legible human message. And here, this was in Wired magazine. This is showing that, in fact, within 6 months of digging that trench, that was made irrelevant because microwave relays came up, and it's faster to do it by air anyway. And so, it's like what, like what, And you see the process here, right? As algorithmic infrastructure becomes sort of delaminated from the Earth that produced it, you can see how shaving microseconds and milliseconds off the surface means learning to look differently than we have. And it would be, it would be faster if you could actually just send the signals through the Earth instead of having to bend around the surface. It takes 84.4 milliseconds to get a signal over the Earth from New York to Sydney. But if you could go right through the middle of it, you could shave 40.2 of those milliseconds right off, right? So, maybe we'll use a goddamn particle accelerator, right? And we'll just shoot neutrino beams through the Earth, and this is proper science fiction, sort of, not really, because they did it at the Fermilab Particle Accelerator a few months ago. And what you see here is like manifest destiny, right? Looking for the next frontier, which we will find. These are some other folks at MIT, Cameron Freer and Alexander Wisner-Gross. And this is a bunch of stuff that I really don't understand around like light cones and quantum entanglement, and I don't really get it. But I know how to read this map, which is that the red circles are where the people are, and where the markets are, and those blue dots are where you're going to have to put the servers if you want to optimize against latency. And you will notice that many of them are underwater, and we will solve that. We'll just build big bubbles underwater or platforms, and we'll part the water and pull money out of the air because it's a bright future if you're an algorithm. And in fact, I actually feel like an idiot for not imagining this before people actually started working on it. But like, this is an actual artist rendering of a reasonably likely future. Somebody had a better idea than the ones I just said, which is like, we'll just float microwave relays in balloons over the ocean, right? This is happening, right? Like, we're on our way to this. Balloons with microwave data relays floating over the ocean, right? And there's some things to work out, some complicated stuff about aligning the signals, but I just know we're going to sort that out. And there's only one little problem, which is something called international airspace, which is, where will these things be situated and who will get to hear the signal before anybody else does, which brings us back to where we started 100 years ago. Because it turns out that the danger that we're listening for is the danger that we've created, right? Listening to signals from the air and hoping that we'll hear something that we recognize, which we probably won't. And we've sort of transformed the markets into something that are so independent from a vision of even collective human consciousness that it's like a dark version of the singularity, right? Like trading derivatives of commodities that once had terrestrial gain, right? But I don't, I'm not the one who's worried about a Terminator or Matrix-like future, because if there's anything that I've learned, and that maybe we've all learned, about what happens when we give computers autonomy, it's that they crash, right? I'm not worried about a future in which computers sort of dominate humans precisely. I'm much more worried about the present, in which they fail spectacularly. And as long as we're sort of sharing the planet with them, we must at some point acknowledge that it's worth keeping human judgment and evaluation somewhere in the loop. The problem is that that loop needs to be more than 650 microseconds, because that's how long it takes to judge something in the human mind, right? So it might not look like the market structure that we have today. It might be something that's built on human time, working together with machines rather than demanding that they do all the hard work of making difficult decisions. So, and apropos human time, I'm well over mine, so thanks for yours, and looking forward to talking with all of you. Thanks.
Great talk, Kevin. There's still a few human beings left at Wide Money. And we've all been told today that we can optimize our personal wealth by approaching the stock market through, following our peers, through following sentiment on social media. But is that just foolish because the algorithms are gradually going to take over every market decision?
I think it's, market structure as it's currently built strongly favors speed as the primary determination of it's exactly what we just heard. It's not important that it be true. It's not important that it be news. It's important that it moves the market. And so if you know that it's going to move the market, it doesn't matter. What matters is your position in that queue, basically, right? And I think the idea that individual investors are going to be able to benefit from insight that is more valuable than that speed, at the moment, I think it's not really that likely to me, right? I think having the advantage of being in the room over in Mahwah, New Jersey, favors institutional traders in ways that it's very hard to compete. That's my take.
Where are you putting your Media Lab salary?
Things like housing. Yeah. So.
Right. Thanks very much for joining us, Kevin.
Thanks to you.